Hi, my name is Stan Stadelman. I'm the Chief Product Owner for the SAP Cloud Platform SDK for iOS, and I want to welcome you to Dev 120. Today, we're going to go through a 40-minute lecture. We're going to cover mostly status of the Cloud Platform SDK for iOS, as well as some of the information for partners and customers of really how do we participate in this SAP iOS ecosystem. So I want to talk a little bit about where do we come from. Let's set a baseline. I want to cover what's new in the SDK. We just had a new release, version 6.0, with support for iOS 14 new features. And then I want to spend some time talking about where are we going. So what does our short-term roadmap looks like, and also what are our strategic criteria for our new feature development. And lastly, I want to cover for partners and customers, how do we participate. So let's start with where we're coming from. So just as a baseline, Cloud Platform SDK for iOS was developed to be native Swift frameworks, to be intuitive to iOS developers using Xcode IDE from Apple, and using as much as possible the native iOS APIs directly. And SAP's participation in this application stack is to add new features that are enterprise specific, that are SAP specific, that speak to user interface, data model, security, and those types of enterprise application considerations that are incremental to the generic iOS platform. And I'll start actually with the UI. In years past, we would tend to start bottom up, kind of foundation up to the UI. But with this SDK, we really embraced design-led development along with the SAP organization. And I think this has really contributed to some of the innovation that we've seen in the application development, and I think really added a really brilliant set of new features to the SAP mobile offering. So the SAP and Apple teams partnered when we started this project to reimagine the Fiori design language that originally was UI5 style applications for native iOS. So iOS and Apple have their human interface guidelines, the HIG, and the two design teams collaborated to describe these standard Fiori components, macro components like floor plans, micro components like views, and compositions like patterns that are intuitive for iOS users that would use standard components like navigation bars, table views, collection views, etc. So what you see here in the UI framework of the SDK is a set of UI views and UI view controller subclasses to start to get to the technical side of things that make it very easy to implement these floor plans at the macro level. There are a set of 5 standard floor plans. Here we have examples of overview, which is kind of your homepage for an application that's going to give you KPIs or high-level overviews, and then summaries of critical business objects, and then links to the facets of your schema and process. A standard object level floor plan that will give you object details and links to related data, a profile, specific flavor of the object, and then the list, of course, is a standard table that's going to have search and filter built in. We then have kind of these patterns that I mentioned. Search has a number of different flavors that the SDK has components for. One is what we call search to select, which is kind of a tag style input that you might see also in iOS Mail natively. Search in terms of scanning. So we have an addition to search bar for barcode launch, as well as text recognition and input. We then have filtering components, table view cells that have different logic around filtering groups, drill downs, mutually exclusive filters, etc. And lastly, we have this hierarchy component that allows you to represent tree data and drill down through a hierarchy in order to navigate to a particular business object. We have a set of kind of notification style views. So banners that can alert users to progress or issues in line. On the left, we have a banner underneath a header. We then have validation views on form input. We have full screen user notifications with action links, and then progress notifications in line for things like downloads. We have macro components. We have the map floor plan, which is an extension on the Apple MapKit framework, and really provides a set of overlay views that can standardize business object representations over the maps. We also then have geospatial editing and GeoJSON geometry definition as a subtype of this. Calendaring, there are a number of different flavors of how calendars get represented into the applications that come out of the SDK. We have full floor plan representations that have selection boxes at the top and then lists of table cells. These can then be compressed into week view, or we can then have full screen, single date or range picking. I mentioned OCR. This is a direction that we've been going in, and I'll go into it a little bit more later in terms of the future strategy, where this is a subtype of the form input or search input. And charting. Charting is a feature that we're really proud of. We acquired a company 3 years ago called Rombi, and Rombi was kind of the original data visualization tool in the iOS App Store, in the Apple App Store. And so we were really proud to have that asset as part of the SDK for the past 2 years. And one of the things that we're also really proud of this year is we went forward and we migrated that core code base to be native SwiftUI. And this gave us a lot of flexibility, the ability to implement features like pinch to zoom and panning in a consistent way across the charts, which is something we've been looking to do. And all of this is an under the hood substitution. It also gives us the opportunity to then really rapidly develop new chart types. In version 5.1, we added support for stocks and also donut. And this is an area of investment for us going forward. It's also being done in the open source community, which is something I'll call out later. So in terms of UI, where are we coming from? We have, as you can see, we have a really robust set of user interface components. We also then designed them in such a way that you can develop your own custom components. And we absolutely expect differentiation by partner and customer developers for your own business styling, custom designs. But these tools can provide really significant productivity improvements in terms of user interface development. And we've seen this and benchmarked this in both internal and partner projects. So the next layer down below the UI is, of course, data. And we are standardized on OData, along with everything else in SAP, UI5, obviously. OData is a RESTful interaction pattern. And the significant aspect of OData from a client development perspective is the fact that the services are self-documenting. And every service provides its own metadata document that details its consumable schema, and then provides a flexible set of annotations that can provide information about the data types, about options, about localization, about data binding. And this is extensible. It's evolved from version 2 to version 4 recently. We now provide support for both online consumption, which I'll get to in a moment, and offline database consumption with some limitations. And this is, this allows developers in the SAP ecosystem to have a consistent interaction pattern against all SAP technology systems. And this is a really big deal for us. We provide a tool set that makes it possible to basically curl down a metadata document. And then we generate what we call a set of proxy classes. And for native iOS developers, these would be analogous to what you would see in terms of NS managed objects when working with core data. These are a set of strongly typed classes that provide access, dynamic access to the OData data values, but also a meta model access to the annotations and the information about the CSDL itself. These can then be refreshed so that you can commingle the dynamic information coming from the service with the statically typed generated information that was last produced by the generator. And we see this in cases of either SAP applications where we're developing kind of a reusable scenario with a fixed set of values, which are then extensible by customers and some partners. And we call this dynamic discovery. So the API set for the OData stack, as I said, we have this dynamic interface. We then have the proxy class. Both of those talk to a common interface called the data service. This is an abstraction of CRUD for entities, links, media, and also provides utilities around batching and change set creation. We, as a philosophical goal, want to provide developers with the ability to program against the data layer, independent of whether the data is local or remote. And so we talk about the remote data in, quote, online mode, where there's a simple network interaction patterns via HTTPS. The offline mode is the case where we actually take the OData queries, we translate it to SQL, and we execute it against a local database that is persisting some subset of data from the backend. Users can then transact against that local data using OData style operations as if they were online. And we then effectively will write those changes locally so that the local user interface is updated. We then maintain an outbound queue of those requests. And then when the user, quote, syncs or uploads, we then will replay those network requests via a servlet and mobile services to the backend and handle the errors. And so in this way, the developer, especially developers coming from UI5 style development that are familiar with OData services and have those already available, can have a single application programming model, regardless of whether they're working with local or remote data. The other thing that I'll come to in a moment is the encryption layer on this. Obviously, the database supports local encryption. We have reusable UI components and kind of a control system that manages user-created passcodes. We call these app passcodes, and also facilitates using the biometric authentication from iOS natively. So Touch ID and Face ID can be integrated into this and then used to generate the derived keys that would be used for encrypting the local database. Setting up those application passcodes and enabling biometric ID authentication are really just one tiny bit of what I used to describe as really 80% of my time, which is user onboarding and user restoration. And this is because there are so many different variations of how this can be done. And it used to be even much more complex in on-premise systems because we had so many, firewall and network perimeter considerations, IDPs everywhere, different flavors of authentication that wanted to be supported, two-factor authentication that needed to be built in potentially. When we moved to SAP Cloud Platform from the on-premise flavor of SAP Mobile Platform, and standardized as Cloud Platform Mobile Services, we really made a huge leap forward because we were able to integrate into the SAP Cloud Platform identity layer. And this standardized so much of this interaction pattern because our customers in general already have SAP Cloud Platform integrated. They would have their tunnel from their on-premise data to the cloud, configured through SAP Cloud Connector, and those identity propagations configured, and can use the standard trust provider interface for integrating their typically SAML IDP. And so this is a really significant level of standardization. We then provide the ability to customize the authentication between the device and the cloud. So there's actually a two-stage authentication step. Device to cloud is one stage where that identity is then authenticated against the IDP. The second stage is then propagating that identity to the backend. Sometimes that's the same technique, sometimes there's two steps. What we really recommend across the board today is OAuth from the device to the cloud, where typically what happens is your OAuth endpoints in the cloud are protected by your SAML IDP. So you end up doing a single SAML style browser-based user authentication on device. And then the OAuth tokens are stored locally in the device and used for subsequent sessions. And then typically a short-lived certificate would be propagated from the cloud to the backend SAP system. And this is really results, we think, in the best user experience, and is more, I think, typical for users that are accustomed to using OAuth style authentication for consumer style applications. But additionally to this, there are a number of other features that go into this, actually getting the application configuration settings. So even telling the application, what server do I point to? We provide a number of options for this. You can either load from a file, you can download from a remote server, you can read a QR code in, is somewhat popular lately. We provide then standard forms for EULA and privacy, and consent, depending on the application use case and the locale in which the application will be used. So the GDPR and the Chinese security and privacy forms would fall into this category. And then, as I mentioned, the app passcode creation and maintenance. These then integrate into Cloud Platform Mobile Services itself. And mobile services is I think, a twofold feature set. One is a set of utility services that powers the applications themselves. So this would be the offline sync is facilitated via a servlet deployed in CPMS, as we call it. It provides a push notification REST API that makes it very easy for a backend to send out a notification that says, send a notification to this user, or all application instances for this user, or all users of this application. And CPMS then manages and maintains the push tokens for all the devices that those users and application instances might have registered, so that that doesn't need to become part of the backend. Policy. So the administrator has the ability to define what should the passcode strength be, what should the log settings be, what should the end user analytics settings be, and how frequently should those be uploaded, under what network conditions should those be uploaded. So those are really a set of utility and policy services. And we're also trying to transition, I think, into also making this a help desk. And I'll speak to this in a moment. So where are we now? So this really brings us to today. So we, as I said, just shipped version 6.0 of the SDK. And we also made an update to Cloud Platform Mobile Services that I think really speaks to this help desk direction. And this is the feature of crash reporting and crash reporting analytics. And I can say we monitor, obviously, the usage of the services, and kind of do some analytics to say, okay, well, these particular types of applications have very consistent or growing utilization. And we try to test hypotheses for what are driving these. And we see the most successful applications that are scaling very consistently over years, that even through COVID, grow, far more significantly than we anticipated, to be frank, are backed by partners or IT administrators that are monitoring and maintaining the system and the users. And so this crash reporting feature is, I think, a real key to assisting that and providing value there. So what we're providing here is a addition to the SAP Foundation framework that collects in-process crashes, and then we'll upload those to CPMS. We then analyze the stack traces to group them into common issues, and then we provide symbolication. So in all of the Cloud Foundry landscapes, we are maintaining the symbol files for the different versions of iOS, and for the SAP SDK frameworks. And we also provide the ability for customers to upload their application-specific symbols, so that you can fully symbolicate and then debug crashes. The other really significant feature that we just rolled out in version 6 is support for iOS 14 widgets. And this is something that as soon as it came out, the SAP executives really started pushing. I know in the developer ecosystem, everybody immediately built a widget. Like this is I think a real, I don't want to say a sea change, but it's a real step forward, I think, for application programmers. And the Assistant, which is a macOS application that comes with the SDK, it's a partner to the SDK. It generates a scaffolding project for new developers and new projects, where you can connect to mobile services, and it will actually run that proxy generator. It will generate all of your onboarding and authentication and local security and biometric authentication based on your policies and your settings. And we immediately got questions: how can I build these widgets that interact with the SDK-based applications? Because the SAP-based applications have passcodes a lot of times, have encrypted storage. How should I share that secure data through the keychain or through the app group persistent storage? And so we have added in a reference extension that uses symmetric key sharing to ensure security for data and keys between the primary process and the auxiliary process, which is what we're calling the widgets. And so this is actually coming out of the box in all of the new projects generated with the version 6.0 Assistant. And this is really exciting because, as you'll see in a moment, extensions are key to Apple's application strategy, and I think their user engagement. And so this will speak to our go forward as well. The other thing that is really critical for us is open source. And as I alluded earlier, we actually began delivering our first open source code in the iOS SDK group in April 2020, when we launched the Cloud SDK iOS Fiori project and began publishing the charting module, Swift package there. That's then being embedded in the SAP Fiori framework. Our strategy is to move additional frameworks from the SDK from binary distribution into open source distribution. And so we're talking about Apache licensed projects. This, I think, is a huge opportunity for us and our existing partners. And we've gone to some lengths in the ecosystem to reduce the barriers for our partners to getting information and speed patches and fixes and new feature development. But really the ideal collaboration scenario for us here, I think, is an open source project where, especially for things like UI, partner developers can fork and add incrementally in their own application projects, submit back if they see fit. We can actually dig in and see what's going on. We can collaborate around GitHub issues. This is a terrific opportunity. We've been working on this for a year now, and we're very excited to be able to have started this season and be rolling this out further. So where are we going? So there are a couple different dimensions on which I see this as a transitionary phase for us. We started this SDK to enable iOS developers, generic iOS developers, to write apps with SAP content. And I think this informed a lot of our design decisions around the SDK in the sense that we assumed a level of iOS developer expertise. This granted us a lot of leverage because developers had full access to the corpus of iOS developer expertise, and they could bring that with them. And that's been absolutely critical to the successes that we've had so far. But we've also reached the point where we need to better enable SAP developers to build iOS experiences. And what do I mean by experiences, and what do I mean by that? So traditionally, the SAP Fiori for iOS applications have been very hierarchical, very master detail user experience. Not always necessarily schema driven, but certainly table views throughout. And what we see in iOS, and what we can infer, I think, from the trajectory of the iOS platform and the user engagement that we see there, we think is really driven by the different interaction points that iOS applications, really best practice iOS applications, offer the user. And these are called extensions, and widgets are a core example of these extensions. But extensions have actually been around for years. So push notifications with rich content, that's an extension. A Siri intent is an extension. The widgets that would show up on the home screen, on the lock screen, those were today extensions. Photo sharing elements that could be embedded and invoked by other applications are extensions. And these all have similar architectural patterns, meaning that they all have the same underlying security and persistence sharing protocols. And we really want to guide our ecosystem of partner applications and SAP applications to adapt these more richly, more broadly, and innovate on them. So this work that we're doing in the assistant to generate this as a standard feature set so that partners and developers can then build upon that rather than reinventing the wheel, I think is a really important step forward for us here. So in terms of the big picture, I see us today in the bottom left. We've really traditionally focused on the offline enabled application use cases. These have been the business critical value drivers. We've supported SAP Fiori 3 design guidelines for iOS, and we're also the native implementation layer for the mobile development kit, which has been significant for us in supporting the SAP Asset Manager application. And as I mentioned, our target developer market has been generic iOS developers and expert developers. We're then in the green phase here for the second half of 2020 and the first half of 2021. And as I said, this is a bit of a transitionary phase for us, I think, where we're modernizing on iOS. And those of you who are deeply in the Apple ecosystem, I think, have seen there's this transition from Objective-C to Swift that is mostly fulminated, and starting to go from UIKit to SwiftUI. And I think the Objective-C to Swift timeline was about 3 years, and I'm seeing that it looks like SwiftUI is going to be pretty similar. And our target is that we will have a migration of Fiori for iOS for SwiftUI. We're going to do this in open source. We will be sharing more information about it in Q1, and we are really excited both internally to get to work with it because we love SwiftUI, and also to be able to collaborate with you around it. But also this focus on iOS widgets, extensions, and lastly, in terms of our developer focus, how do we bring SAP developers to build iOS experiences? This, I think, is providing higher level macro components. So instead of just UI views, providing floor plans that are pre-integrated, that already have the headers integrated, then the search, and provide the option to toggle between a profile or a KPI header that have filtering pre-integrated. So we've begun to ship those components in version 6, and we'll be innovating on those throughout the remainder of those minor releases on the 6.0 branch. The other really significant thing that we're working on here is building on these macro components to begin to support rendering for OData annotations. And OData annotations are core to SAP's web application development. And our goal is to support content that is either exactly reused or very similar to content developed for web applications in native iOS experiences that can then be encircled and extended with native SwiftUI development, so that aspects of the application can be hybrid in that everything is native. This view is rendering an annotation, so the developer didn't actually need to program the binding locally, transitioning to this view, which is custom SwiftUI. And that I think is a real opportunity for us in terms of supporting SAP's goal and strategy of low code. Next step beyond this, and these are things that we're also working on, we're starting to look at the ARKit story and dig into some of those use cases and features. The experience management side of things, with Qualtrics being spun off, I think the strategy will continue to be that Qualtrics has its own native iOS SDK that will continue in parallel with the SAP Cloud Platform SDK for iOS. We'll provide some best practices for how to incorporate that SDK into applications like those coming from the SAP Assistant, from the Cloud Platform SDK for iOS Assistant. And we've really gotten, I think, great feedback from some of our partners, probably on this call, about how this user feedback, really covers a spectrum between just not only product information, so not only I want feedback on this application, but also business data. So feedback on these assets, feedback on this particular process in real time, and how there's a spectrum there of use cases for the Qualtrics feedback. So that's a really exciting space of innovation for us. And lastly, on the machine learning side, so we've been, I think, rather quietly adding features into the SDK in the ML category. We provided the text recognition view a couple of releases back. Originally, it was based on Google Mobile Vision, and with iOS 13 supporting OCR natively in the iOS Vision framework, we were able to then refactor that so that our stack now is 100% Vision framework based. We provide some out-of-the-box views there that do simple pattern matching out of some of the standard iOS recognizers for things like addresses, email, map, phone numbers, etc. We also provide the ability to inject regex into that, so you can have your custom extraction and complex capture group extraction, which I think is really recommended for a lot of standard cases. But one of the other things that we've added here is a topology API. So we will take the recognized text and decompose it into lines, into rows and columns to help support those cases where the extraction or capture points should be positional rather than relative to the structure of the text. And so these are a set of APIs that are in the SDK today. The other thing that we provided over the last year is what we call a CoreML downloader. CoreML is the format for the machine learning model files that are executed locally. And we provide a utility that piggybacks on the client resources service to check with CPMS if there's a new version of a core ML file, download that, compile that locally, and allow you to update your model dynamically without redistributing an application level. And that's a really big thing also. So how do we participate? And so this section, I think, will speak mostly to partners, but is relevant to customer developers as well. So in terms of our application portfolio from SAP, obviously we have kind of two dimensions of reuse versus differentiation. And when we're looking at SAP standard apps, we're really looking at prioritizing reuse. So we have really broad adoption of applications like SuccessFactors and Concur. We also have the SAP Asset Manager application, which supports some configuration that falls into this category. On the other end of the spectrum, obviously, we have high-end differentiation. So these would be bespoke applications developed for customers. And we have just some brilliant use cases here, these reference cases, some of which are listed here. And in the center, we have what we call the Fast Start program. And this I want to spend a moment on. So these are a set of packaged partner solutions. I would think of these as 70% applications that are implemented and validated by SAP and Apple with the partner, and then we develop a go-to-market around. And that's the real key aspect of this. So I want to call this out, and we have a number of really successful Fast Start partners that we're very proud of. We want to continue to grow that base. And we have a standard flow for this. I think the program is, let's say 18 months, 2 years old at this point, and we're transitioning into phase 2 of that. And we have this pipeline whereby the opportunities are assessed and reviewed with SAP for analysis with respect to their own portfolio and Apple's go-to-market initiatives. We develop actually the proposal. The proposal goes through design reviews with SAP and Apple. And then once the solutions are prepared, we then do joint go-to-markets. And one thing that I want to call out here is the App Center. We've been successful in migrating most of our Fast Start solutions into the App Center. And this is a real key for us because that opens up additional go-to-market resources, is critical for becoming part of our industry cloud go-to-market. And so we're really encouraging all of our partners to continue to do that. So thank you for coming. For additional information, please join us at Dev 107. This is a product manager and portfolio management session. Also join Partner 161, is a 2-hour hands-on demo session where we'll do technical deep dives into the crash reporting and widget and SwiftUI topics that we were looking at. Please join and subscribe to the Learning Hub so that you get updates and notifications and access to the full breadth of content from the conference. And for additional information, please contact myself and our partner manager, Holger Fritzinger. Thank you.